So back when I was making my initial rounds at guitar stores, my goal most of the time was to find the most expensive guitar amp combo humanly possible and to play the absolute life out of it until whoever I was with at the time had decided they had finally had enough and they were ready to force me to put the guitar down and go. Now, amongst all of these different guitar and amp combos, I definitely had my favorites. I loved the American Strats. I loved playing the 335s when they didn't have them completely locked up. And amp-wise, I always sort of shifted towards the Princetons. But once I had been doing this for a little bit, one of the things that I started to notice in different guitar stores is that my mindset actually began to shift. I started off wanting to play the most expensive thing humanly possible, but the more I started going into different stores and realizing that there were some legitimate guitars in here that I might actually want to get my hands on in the future, I knew that I would have to be a little bit more realistic with what I was actually playing through, specifically when it came to amp. You see, it felt like there was this sort of sweet spot when it came to trying different guitars through guitar store amps. I didn't want to play through something too expensive like a Dumble or a hand-wired AZ30 that would give me a completely unrealistic expectation in comparison to the type of amps that I was playing at home at the time. And also on the other end, I didn't want to play through something too cheap that would make even like the greatest of guitars sound like a complete toy. Which unfortunately meant as much as I loved the Princeton Reverb and literally thought of it as like my dream amp at the time, I would have to pivot elsewhere to something that I knew every single guitar store would carry. Can you guess what it is? I'll give you a second. Okay, seconds up. It's called a Blues Junior. Now, the lore goes pretty deep when it comes to the Blues Junior. I first discovered it when I was a first-time tube amp buyer, and at the time, I didn't know a lot about Fender amps or even just amps in general. So I started to make my way around different guitar stores to see what they had, and I started to find a consistent theme of them having their like higher-end tube amps, like their Princetons and their twin reverbs, which I didn't even know what those were called at the time. And then on the other end of the spectrum, they had like their early versions of the Fender Mustangs. And sandwiched right between those two, they had what I perceived to be as their more affordable line of tube amps. And that's where we ended up having things like the Super Champ X2 and of course the Blues Junior. And in my mind, there wasn't even a slight question of which one I would eventually go for. I mean, I had watched video after video after video of how much people absolutely adored the Blues Junior and how this pro that I looked up to was using it on the road and how that pro that I was looking up to was using it in the studio. However, at that moment, what I was trying to do was just stretch the $1,000 that I had left over from my summer job to a tube amp and an American Strat, and the Super Champ X2, well, it was just cheaper. So I ended up going with the X2, which wasn't necessarily exactly what I wanted, but it still had tube in the name, which was enough to make me more excited than I had ever been about an amp. And I ended up using that amp for a long time, like a number of years, and it has a very special place in my heart, not just because I genuinely think it sounded good, but also that was the first amp that I took to my first ever couple of gigs, and also the amp I really cut my teeth on learning a lot of the riffs that I still love to play today. But I still wondered about the Blues Junior, and I still thought about it. And when I would go to different guitar stores, a lot of the time, if they would have like a new guitar that I wanted to check out, and I pulled down that oh so epic Silver Sky, and the guitar clerk or employee or whatever would be like, "What do you want to play that through, homeboy?" I'd be like, maybe a Blues Junior would sound good. And when I would talk about it with those same employees or even with friends outside the guitar store world, the similar response was, "Oh dude, that amp is absolutely nasty." And that still happens today, like 8 or 9 years later. And I want to show you why in a lot of ways, I actually think they were right. So this is the Blues Junior, and specifically it's the 4th version, but more on that in a second. It was originally introduced in 1995 along with the Hot Rod Deluxe and the Hot Rod DeVille as the cheaper of the 3 options. It's 15 watts all tube and has one 12-inch speaker. It's got 2 EL84s and 3 AX7s, and in reference to it being the 4th version, there are some very minor differences between this and the original, the biggest being that the original actually had the green circuit board. But I know it, you want more than the specs, so let's really see what this bad boy can do. Now, the first reason why I think this amp is just as nasty as its reputation often states is because it sounds really, really good at low volumes. And I know this because when I first unboxed this, it was around 11 p.m., which is way past quiet hours at my apartment. And I was thinking to myself, let me wait until tomorrow to actually see what it can do. But I was so excited. I was like, let me just see what this thing can do at 2 or 3. I was significantly floored with just how much fullness there was and just how much I wasn't losing, even with the master volume only at 2 or 3. Even once I started to record things for this video or do different recordings to see just how the amp would do against some of my different Fender amps and whatnot, it was like there never really reached a point where I had to push the master volume past 3 or 4. I think the absolute power of that volume knob kind of leads into my second point, which is just how versatile this amp actually is. Not even just in a genre sense, but in the fact that I can leave this at 2 or 3 and bring this just to my bedroom without annoying my neighbors. But also the Blues Junior is the amp that you can take to a gig, because if you did want to crank it all the way up to 10, or I guess 12 in this matter, I'm not even going to try and play that for you just in fear of getting addicted. Like, it can handle both those settings really well. Now, the next reason why I think this amp really lives up to the hype and all of its big reputation is because of this little switch called the Fat Switch. Now, I was talking to my friend Mike the other day, and I told him that I had gotten a Blues Junior, and he was like, bro, this is one of my favorite amps. I've had it for years. Let me show you my settings. And he texts me a picture, and he says, I keep the Fat Switch on at all times. Now, with it being a one-channel amp, it really does just give it that extra boost when someone's not necessarily using other pedals. But the way that I wanted to really use it was with like a more single coil guitar, really crank the gain on this and crank up the boost, and then lower the volume on the actual guitar, get sort of like that Hendrixy clean thing. Now, the other really important reason why I think this thing lived up to its reputation is because of the actual reverb. Now, with amps like this, I'm not necessarily expecting a big ambient reverb, and that's not really what this gave me in the first place. But just being a worship player, this isn't the type of reverb where I could just throw away my pedals and just stick to this thing, like maybe you could with a Fat Switch in exchange for like a Tube Screamer. But this was so much more ambient than I was expecting. When you crank it up to 12, you just get this really beautiful reverb that, outside of maybe the worship stuff and some of like the Coldplay pop stuff that I've been doing, would be more than suitable for most genres. So at the end of the day, what did I even learn? Well, let me tell you. I used to think of something like a Blues Junior as a really cool, cost-effective alternative to some of Fender's higher-end amps like a Princeton or a Twin. But the more I actually played the Blues Junior, both in guitar stores and once I got to know it in here, I realized it's not even necessarily just a cost-effective alternative. It's just a different option with a different sound. This is probably one of the most hyped amps, I think, on the market right now. People just rave about this amp non-stop, and it gets more hype than amps sometimes that are double and triple its price range. But like I said, the more that I actually use it, I see why that is. And the more research I do into different players that are using it, like a Noel Gallagher who said he uses this amp on tour, or like James Bay in one of his best performances ever of Let It Go, he's like, I just used a Blues Junior. And this is coming from someone who had a Princeton, who is now very much wishing he didn't sell it, so I could have done the shootout between the two to actually see how different the sounds are, but maybe that'll come at a later date. But at the end of the day, I don't think it really matters what I think. What matters is what you think. Have you played the Blues Junior? Do you like the Blues Junior? What's your favorite Fender amp of all time, or that you've owned? Please let me know in the comments. Anyways, thank you so much for watching this video. I feel like the Blues Junior video was kind of inevitable on my channel. Like, I've been playing a lot of these different amps and like making different videos on them, and I got the 57 Champ probably about a month or so ago, and ever since I've been playing that and playing the Blues Junior and just A-Bing it, it's been a really cool experience, and I want to be able to do the same thing with the Princeton one day, and I think that'll be really fun. But in terms of this specific guy right here, I got it from the homies at Sweetwater. The links are in the description. Make sure to check it out. It's one of the best ways to support the channel if that's something you want to do, or if you're curious about any of the other gear, guitars, amps, cables, cameras that I use in this video, make sure to check out those links. Also, thank you so much to all of my patrons. There's some exclusive stuff on there if you want to join the community. Like and subscribe if you had a good time, and most importantly, like most important of all, have a fantastic day.